welcome to Borderlines. We are recording this on November 15, 2024. It is just Deanna and I today, and we are going to be discussing a report from the House of Commons Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration titled Conditions for Growth, Reconsidering Closed Work Permits in the Temporary Foreign Workers Program. The report is 92 pages and involves recommendations for reforming the temporary foreign worker program by Canada's three, I guess, main political parties. The Bloc Québécois supporters might not like that description, but it is what it is, in which there are recommendations by the Liberals, the Conservatives, and the NDP. It's almost like, in a way that, and this may or may not be accurate assessment, but it is almost like the three political parties are staking their positions on prospective changes ahead of the next election.
Mm. And I think people are contemplating that the IRPA is kind of reaching the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act is reaching its expiration date. And I think there has been a lot of discussion among lawyers about, is a new act imminent or whatnot. So I don't know if it's also perhaps in anticipation of that. Who knows?
And it's coming at a time when the current government has pledged in its 2025-2027 immigration levels plan to introduce caps on the number of foreign workers for the first time in modern Canadian history. It was, we commented when we were reading it that it's interesting that this report and its recommendations came down at a time that the government has explicitly stated that it wants foreign workers to be leaving and has implemented all sorts of measures to essentially make extending work permits for existing foreign workers very difficult. We've talked about that in previous episodes. Mark Miller actually this week announced that there was going to be increased resources towards ensuring that people who need to go leave. We will see what that looks like. He also commented that his previous, we've talked a bit about how he went from promising regularizing the status of all undocumented individuals in Canada to cutting immigration levels. And one of his comments this week was that any talk of a broad regularization of people without status will have to wait until after the next election, which is interesting framing. At the same time, he said that there may be regularization efforts in niche examples for industries where there are labor shortages prior to the next election, which, as we talked about also in previous episode, makes it really complicated to advise people who are in Canada without status. But before we segue too far away from the report, I don't know if there's anything else you want to mention about maybe just the structure of work permits in general before we get into the regulation or the proposed changes. If you want to do a brief summary on just how being a foreign worker in Canada works.
Well, I mean, I would say for the most part, work permit holders are on what we call closed work permits, meaning that their work permit confines them to a particular occupation, a particular location, and a particular employer. And the process for shifting from one employer to the other is if I'm being kind, I would say complex. If I'm being realistic and myself, I would say ludicrous, bureaucratic, and Kafkaesque, my favorite word. And so, the processes are becoming extremely more and more cumbersome all the time. And the procedures to do, for example, an LMIA application, posting job ads for a month, doing all sorts of things that it's not just that they are onerous, it's that they don't reflect the way things work in a real workplace. And so somebody might have done months and months of recruiting, hired a headhunter, done all sorts of stuff, very aggressively try to recruit somebody, and all of those forms of recruitment will be disregarded. They want them to do this very specific type of recruitment that doesn't actually make sense for that industry in order to pass the test. And so you kind of have to backtrack and do it the way that the rules require. But ultimately, I think what Steve's getting at is that the requirements of the work permit are very confining, things that um, that the United Nations have taken note of, that they're confining to the point that it's almost creating an environment akin to like modern forms of slavery. And this, I think, is another thing that perhaps prompted this study, was the very damning report that came from the United Nations. And frankly, this is not the first report. It's not even the second report. We've been repeatedly seeing reports. In the past, they might have been confined to certain subgroups like the agricultural workers, the caregivers. But there's an interesting CBC article that we can link to in the show notes, which describes the report and even the report itself. But as I said, there are multiple ones, but in the article, our friend Amanda Aziz has talked about some of her experiences. She's been on the show before. But anyways, there's a long history to this. This is not a new issue.
Yep. And Deanna mentioned, I think, that the work permits limit people to employer, location, and occupation. Occupation is more narrow than what people might think. So, for example, if somebody has a work permit to work as a software engineer and their company wants to promote them to manager, that would actually require a new work permit, possibly going through that whole labor market impact assessment that Deanna was mentioning. Processing times for that. I mean, I think that they're still processing some from February and it's mid-November right now. So a foreign worker looking to get promoted might have to wait months and months to get that promotion. Deanna didn't mention wage. The work permits themselves don't prohibit raises, but if the employee is on a closed work permit, the employer would have either had to do what's called an online offer of employment or get a labor market impact assessment where they commit to paying a certain wage. And the employer could be fined if they actually increase a foreign worker's wages.
Mm.
It's very, very limiting right now.
Yeah. And I would say too, like, I mean, part of the reason that this is such a topic of interest for both of us, I believe, is that it kind of goes to this point of the very mixed messaging we're getting. Minister Miller has called the United Nations report inflammatory, not denying that there are issues of abuse, but on the one hand saying cut, 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 maybe ameliorative relief after the election. But again, the agenda is very confusing. If you're saying I recognize there is abuse, but we want to send people home, but maybe later we'll provide an amnesty, it's very, very difficult to glean what the overall message is. Are these people who are being victimized by Canada? Are they people who are being evicted from Canada for some kind of wrongdoing? Are we waiting for them to be actually given some kind of relief because they are actually required? And so, um, uh, yeah, it just leads to this
Yeah.
environment of instability, and at a time where we really do need that kind of stability. And so, yeah.
Well, we want Canada to hire newcomers. At the same time, we're going to make it unbelievably restrictive. As I mentioned in the episode with Alex Kraft that we did, I would wager a guess that part of the reason why new permanent residents experience such difficulty in finding employment is that when they submit their resumes to an employer, the employer can't distinguish them between a foreign national and they may have had a bad experience with the temporary foreign worker program. One of
They
the
almost
craziest
certainly
example,
had
yeah.
a bad
Well, I can
experience with
give
the foreign
the
worker program.
craziest example that I can think of was a company hired someone on a young professional's work permit, which essentially the only requirements for that work permit are that the person be from a country that Canada has a youth mobility agreement with, that they be under 35, and that be working in a skilled position. They got a work permit for this person from Germany to work as an administrative assistant. The company wanted to give them the opportunity to work in a specific trade. And so they provided some trade training to that person. Still a skilled position, but as Deanna mentioned, the work permits say that you're limited to a certain occupation. The company got fined, or at least was threatened with a fine. And by the end of it, they basically said never again. And that is sort of the restrictions caused by this closed work permit regime
Mhm.
that Parliament or the House of Commons committee was dealing with.
And
So
ultimately, like the purpose of that compliance regime was supposed to be to protect foreign workers from abuse, not to impose this bureaucratic nightmare on employers for infractions that sometimes were accidental infractions. They didn't read the fine print and realize that certain things were going to be considered violations, that they weren't supposed to promote people without, all of this sort of thing. And so, does it actually accomplish the purpose of preventing abuse? I would say 100% no, because those who are the most vulnerable are not being benefited by it. They are still being removed in situations where they have actually been abused, but it is having this deterrent effect on so many employers who've been burned. And it's so onerous to actually get the approval in the first place that it's not serving the labor market objectives.
yeah. And then on the compliance side, it's onerous because usually a compliance inspection, which all employers of foreign nationals on closed work permits are supposed to go through at some point. I believe at one point the target was basically every employer would go through an inspection once every 4 years. They have to provide pay stubs, they have to provide timesheets, they have to provide proof of harassment training. I mean, obviously that's avoiding harassment training, not how to harass. They have to provide attestations. They have to provide all sorts of business license, all sorts of documents,
It
and
does
it's very
appear
onerous.
sometimes it's like the department is trying to discourage people from using foreign workers by making the process as unappealing as possible. Now, I fully appreciate that you want to make a mandate to prioritize Canadian employees, but doing it by making the program as unappealing as possible seems like a very poor way of accomplishing that.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
so,
I'm not even sure that I mean, that may be one of the purposes is to prioritize Canadians, but this applies to people who aren't in the temporary foreign worker program, but also the international mobility program. It
yeah,
applies to a Canadian company that hires a management consultant from the United States to come up once a month for a few months. And because of the all employers are supposed to go through it, they'll get notified as well. But anyway,
I would love to see some kind of like outcome measurements from the compliance program. Like, had it actually achieved the goals for which it was put in place? Has it ended any of the evils um, that were seen to like that were the purpose statement for putting in the compliance regime in the first place?
yeah.
I would be
Well,
very
none
curious.
of the recommendations from any of the parties involve tracking some sort of way of measuring if this is effective. So we can put that to the side and maybe get through probably not all, but at least some of the recommendations from each of the parties. The governing party obviously has the most. And the first one is to increase the cap on temporary foreign workers in the agri-food sector from 20 to 30%. Basically, right now, for what's called low-wage LMIAs, there's a cap that employers in agriculture or employers in most industries can't have more than, I think it's now down to as low as 10% foreign workers, with even restrictions completely on low-wage foreign workers in areas that have a unemployment rate of 6% or more, which for those in British Columbia is pretty much everywhere but the island. This again is just one of those things that as, it's kind of odd that as the government is slashing cuts like this, their MPs in committee are recommending increasing the cap.
Mhm. I have to say I have real mixed feelings for this recommendation. I feel like there's no component of the temporary foreign worker program that's more that has more flagrant abuses than the I mean, we're talking agri-food sector, so we're not talking about the strictly the laborers, like the lowest end of the agri-food sector. I think it's probably different if we're talking about the supervisory and the management type positions, but the low wage earners in the agri-food section has been a complicated
Yep.
um, portfolio, let's just say.
The next one is without really any specifics to reduce the paperwork burden in all of their programs, and to prioritize processing work permits for foreign workers who are changing employers.
Mm.
This is a big one. It's a huge one right now, especially because because of wage restrictions, a lot of foreign workers right now are scrambling to try to find employers who will support them with a labor market impact assessment or some other closed work permit because they have no choice. There are no options with their current employer. I'm sure your firm is getting bombarded, probably with levels I would speculate not seen in recent history of a certain level of desperation out there right now.
Yeah, for sure. I think everybody across the country is saying that. And I mean, this public policy was issued during the pandemic which enabled people, like, let's say you're applying for a work permit based on an LMIA and you already have a work permit for an LMIA, you could apply for, normally, while you were waiting for the new one to be processed, you could only work for the old employer. But this process, you could say, can I have interim permission to switch employers while I'm waiting for the new one to be processed? It was a kind of, I haven't done one of these exemption requests in ages just because I don't do work permit applications, but it was a bit of a shit show before. Like, I remember when I did do one, like, you had to actually duplicate the wording, including the punctuation. And if you didn't have the punctuation correct, it would just ignore your request or deny it. Like, it was bizarre. I don't know if it's better than it was before, but a lot of people don't even know if it's still in place because they initiated
That's where their
so many of
recommendation,
these.
publicize this
Exactly.
policy more widely and
Yeah, somebody
include
in
the,
my firm just was like, does this still exist? Yes, it
yeah,
still
it
exists.
actually works pretty well. They do it,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like under a week right now. The part
Mhm.
that has kind of always puzzled me is why don't they just issue a work permit then?
I don't
Like
know.
the current time for the work permits on the IRCC website is I think now up to 168 days
And you
for a
also
work
have to
permit.
get your LMIA. So, like,
Yeah.
if it's an
So
LMIA based permit, so it
if
could
the
be,
yeah, so it's the thing that I don't understand is are we, what are we avoiding or what
I
are we
don't know.
gaining by not just issuing a work permit if we're going to let them start working for the new employer?
I really don't know, especially because, like, in BC, you have to do the provincial foreign worker registration, then the LMIA, and then the work permit. I don't know if there's a point at which you can apply for the exemption. Do you have to already have the work permit application in process, or I don't remember how that.
Yeah, you have to have the work permit extension application in process and you can pad it with like, we're waiting for the registration, we're waiting for the
Yes.
LMIA.
Okay.
As the
But it
saying
could be up
goes, you
to a
don't get what you
year.
don't ask for. Oh,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
it's
Yeah.
slow and only getting slower.
Yeah, but again, if they can issue that interim authorization, I'm totally with you. Just give a permit because that is like a thing that you can hold in your hand and show to somebody. And it has an expiration date. And that way, like, because if the work permit ultimately gets refused, what status did you have? You just had implied status, but you can't show anything to show when your
Yep.
status ended. And when it refuses, it's like, if it's refused, it's like your status disappears on that day as opposed to like on the date that your interim document expires.
It's all very
It's
strange.
very, very strange. I mean, I
Um,
know that they do this in Australia. They give an interim document with an expiration date.
there was quite a bit about prioritizing interviews for vulnerable work permits, simplifying the process for them, lowering the threshold for success, and making sure that IRCC receives cultural training and trauma-informed decision making. We did a whole episode on vulnerable worker work permits. I don't know if there's anything you think about the recommendations or
I just I think the recommendations are recommendations, but I think that um, I always laud any recommendation to be trauma informed and to recognize vulnerability. But I think that these shifts need to be cultural shifts. And this is where I will mention the gender-based guidelines that have just been passed by CBSA, and with a shout out to Kamaljit Lihal, my friend and colleague, who was very instrumental in putting some of that feedback to the CBSA. Again, I love this stuff. I think it's great that you have it, but it has to be a cultural shift within the department and a change of the framework. So words are just words.
Yeah, the are also calls for more inspections, more tracking of details on how many were virtual, how many are in person, how many are on site, how many are unannounced, um, and bigger fines and more bans for companies that are abusive.
Yeah. To me, it's just like I want this sort of inspection regime. I don't know how you feel about this, Steve, but like I want it to be purposive, like not just so that there's ways of getting more money into the government coffers. But I would rather that it's something that's ameliorative with respect to the workers. The idea, because what ultimately happens to the worker is that if they're found to be working in such a site, maybe they'll get a vulnerable worker work permit. What I've been hearing a lot of is that trying to then extend that work permit further after the initial, I think it's 6 months, is very, very difficult to do. They're like,
You're talking
okay,
about the
now you
vulnerable work
recovered.
permit?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a year, but they can't be extended, I think.
yeah.
Unless
And
the abuse is still occurring, but I don't know the situation where someone would get that work permit unless they stay with their existing employer or they just land with another bad employer,
mhm.
that the abuse would be continuing.
So I've dealt with a number of cases where people are nearing the end or have already ended those, and they've tried to put into place a new thing. But because of how long the processing times are for provincial registration, LMIA, getting a new work permit, and they're not in good situations when
Yeah.
they've left the employer that rendered them vulnerable. So it's not like they're hitting the ground running in a lot of cases. Sometimes they're pretty egregious sexual abuse and all that kind of stuff. So, um,
And there's the issue with permanent residence where, and I think we talked about this in the episode on open vulnerable work permits, but someone who is working for that abusive employer on a closed work permit will get points towards their permanent residency, whereas they won't if they have
yes,
reported the abuse and get an
the
open
phone,
work permit under the vulnerable worker work permit
not you.
program, which is a huge way to dissuade people from actually
Yeah, I know.
accessing the program.
Yeah, 100% it is. So yeah, like I think that more compliance I am not for. I mean, I feel like, yeah, I mean, that's where I stand there.
Yeah. I think at a minimum, I'd like to see where until they've gone through all of the inspections for the employers who are being inspected because there was a complaint, until that backlog is cleared, I would reduce the amount of random inspections because I'm sure they catch stuff with them, but as you said, it's probably is either accidental small breaches. And an example of that would be the rule that, employers have to provide information about foreign worker rights in both English and French somewhere on the company premise. And, a British Columbia employer that hasn't provided the documentation in French, yeah, I mean, I guess they catch it, and it's a legislative requirement as of September 2022 that all employers have to provide this in both official languages. It's not, as you said, it's just, it seems to be compliance for the sake of compliance.
It's really like red tape compliance to
Oh,
me.
yeah.
Yeah. And there's lots of examples of that too. When it's like you haven't been paying overtime, and as part of the mitigation plan, they have to go back and yeah, I agree. That's good. I like it. But but ultimately I don't know that I mean, I don't know what the backlog is for the complaints-based program. Do you have a sense of that?
Nope.
Yeah. Okay.
None of them are that fast.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
um, This one's interesting. Curious to hear your thoughts. IRCC create a 2-hour mandatory paid workshop that for foreign workers about their rights and responsibilities while in Canada.
Responsibilities. Yeah. I mean, I think that this just takes me back to something that you just said, which is that we're talking about a complaint mechanism. Firstly, IRCC would need to earn the trust of the workers. Um,
Hmm.
my view is at this particular moment, no foreign worker is going to go to IRCC and say, "Hey, I'm not being paid properly. Can you help?" It's just, it's not like, no way. They're being told that they might be kicked out, that they might not get a pathway to permanent residence. They might go to the employment standards branch, but there's no way. I can't imagine any foreign worker thinking that this is your ally. Um, and so,
Right?
yeah, like they might be worried that that's going to show that they're not a genuine job, that they're not going to be able to get the points for this. Like, and so that making it a mandatory program that they must do and that they're combining it with what their rights are and also what their obligations are. It's like, here's how to, this is what you're entitled to, and this is what you might be punished for. It's like, again, uh, this is not set them up for success in trying to foster like, hey, this employer is not treating me well. What's your plan here? Are you trying to punish workers? Are you trying to help them? You can't do both and try and do that
Yeah.
effectively.
I think they would need, like, if they're going to have a class like that, they would need a straightforward answer to the question, if I report my employer being non-compliant, will I be removed from
A
Canada?
hundred percent, a hundred
And the
percent.
answer to that can't be maybe.
Maybe,
Like,
which is exactly what it is right now. In fact, right now it's kind of like probably.
yeah, help them get their numbers down. The this one now gets a little more ambitious, issuing after consultation with Quebec, the provinces and territories, issuing sectoral and regional work permits instead of employer-specific ones to industries that are experiencing labor shortages.
Well, that is what they did for the caregivers. That's the only place I've ever seen that happen, where caregivers can now get a permit to be a caregiver, not employer specific. The thing that's bizarre about how they did it, though, is that they said you either are a child care provider or you're an elder care provider. You can't be both. Um, but it's
Hmm.
made it very confusing because when you go on to apply for permanent residency, they say you can't use as your employer the agency, which to me is nonsensical because, like, that's almost always how those in the private, like in the real world, in the non-foreign worker world, that's almost always how it works. You
Yeah.
report to an agency and then you get sent out, but that invalidates the work experience for caregivers. I like the idea in principle. I think it's great. It's
They,
just because of this obligation to be able to prove this continuous full-time employment, it would be very challenging. It would need to actually map onto the PR program in a sensible way.
yeah, they'd have to work that out. They seem to always muse about this. I remember in 2022 or 2023, must have been 2022 because it was Sean Fraser, then mused about a global high-tech strategy for Canada. And one of the things they mused about was a industry broad innovation stream of work permit under the International Mobility Program. And I've read the briefing notes where they look at their options, and option one was very broad, right? Sector specific in STEM, open work permits. And what they went for was work permits where you don't need an LMIA for 8 companies. That would be closed to those companies. So
Well,
there just seems to be there's resistance. I actually was speaking with Asha at UBC yesterday, and I said that I would also be interested, and I think a better idea would be work permits that are limited to the employer, where as long as the base wage that was agreed upon in the LMIA is met, that the employer can do raises, can move people around within the company, can change locations to just make it easier for employers to employ foreign workers as they would any other Canadian, as long as again, like they meet the base salary of whatever they agreed
mm.
to in the LMIA.
Yeah. Well, Asha's doing this very interesting cross-sectional study of immigration that I'm sure we'll hear more about in the months and years to come. But
Yeah.
um, this
We
I
are
don't know if you
probably
saw.
part of the same study.
Yes, I imagine so. Um, but um, but I mean, my interest is like I think I agree with the sentiment of what you're saying, but I feel like my sentiments go more towards attaching the entitlement to the worker than attaching the entitlement to the business. I feel like so much of where we've gone wrong. I understand our worker scheme has been very employer driven. I feel like, in my view, that is a problematic ideology. And that's something that Asha spoke about in her previous study that we had her on the show to talk about. That sort of human capital model um, that Jason Kenney endorses. But to me, it's like if a person is considered to be somebody who has skills that we are interested in, I think the work permit is a way to enable them to come into Canada and try. We are trying to facilitate them reaching the highest level of their skills ability rather than confining them and locking them into one particular place, you know?
Yeah, I get it. Yours is like what you're the whole sectoral or regional specific work permit is, I guess, a broader step, a more ambitious step than what I'm proposing. Certainly, like if we could expand the paradigm more, what you're talking about would make sense. I don't know at that point why you wouldn't just give them PR.
Yeah,
If
I
they
don't know why you wouldn't give them PR. That's what I'm saying. I
yeah,
think that it's like I agree. I think I'm sort of working more in my old age to the like open kind of open market, but like give somebody PR and you're just selecting people based on this combination of things. And you're like, well, this is a person who's likely to end up in this kind of an area. And that sort
yeah,
of like just looked at those analytics, like, and we are going to need certain people in this type of thing and that kind of thing. And then that's like, this is the complement that we're looking for. And then allow them to adjust based on their ability and their competencies and all that sort of thing, and not try and pigeonhole them into that spot and then hold them there. Because I
yeah,
think it's like artificially tinkering with the natural selection kind of.
yeah. Right now, I don't think there's any political appetite
Nope.
to broaden PR. So within the confines of what I think is plausible, I think the open work permit for employer, an employer specific work permit with certain baselines, is the least ambitious but most feasible approach. And I would also make them longer, but again, that's probably not politically feasible right now. Neither is recommendation 12, which was to create more pathways for permanent residents for foreign workers in low wage and primary agricultural streams. We know it's not going to happen in at
Yeah.
least the 2025 to 2027 immigration levels plan. Recommendation is likely dead on arrival or until after the next election, as Mark Miller said. And then the last one is like one of these recommendations that is so broad as to be what's the point, which is to bring stakeholders together to discuss best practices. So that's the
Yeah.
liberals.
The fact that that doesn't actually exist is like a little bit sad and shocking, but
Well, that was like how up until this year. Well, I remember at the start of the year when they're like, for the first time, Canada will be basing its immigration levels plan on part on what the economy and housing needs are. And you just sit there and you're like, what was it before?
yeah, seriously. Yeah, well, this is kind of
Um,
like what Siavash talked about in a previous episode about like having a national strategy. It's like
yeah.
it seems so basic, just basic
Who do you want to do first, the NDP or the Conservatives?
in terms of what their reaction to this was.
Their own recommendations. And you can
Oh,
almost, I don't know to what extent you can view them as like possible potential platforms in a
yeah.
future election. Why don't we start with the Conservatives?
Yes, let's start.
Very like, so the recommendation one is that the agriculture foreign worker program be completely separate from the temporary foreign worker program.
Okay.
Yeah, right. It's impossible. So it's impossible to know what that means if they are, it would just mean that they want to get rid of the LMIA for it. They basically talk about how it needs to be faster and cheaper.
Or maybe they want it to be part of those MOUs with Mexico and Jamaica and
Yeah, I mean the
whatever.
seasonal agriculture worker program's just part of the temporary foreign worker program. So whatever they're proposing is,
They want
um,
bilateral agreements with particular states, no claim to permanent residency. We'll
yeah,
have you when we get you, and then I don't know, like a
they want it
disposable
completely
workforce.
rethought on, but I don't see any details.
That'd be my
So,
guess.
okay.
Yeah.
Um, they condemn that Canada needs to condemn the report that compares our foreign worker programs to slavery.
Okay. I love when a Canadian party condemns the United Nations. Good times.
Yeah, I don't know, like it's just one of those, all right, condemn it, agree with it. If what are they going to do on the ground?
Yeah.
And then kind of the same thing. And their last recommendation, which is in consultation with industry, develop standards to strike the right balance between addressing labor shortage and ensuring workers are treated with respect.
I
So one of
love that
those vague
industry is the
commitments.
only stakeholder. Like,
Yeah,
okay, that's good. Yeah. Not those hacks at the UN, but industry.
and that's it. That's all the
Amazing.
conservative MPs added.
This does not put
The
the fear in you of this being the ruling party in Canada.
there's so little in it that
Yes.
yeah, but
It's just pure dogma.
they could still be thinking what they want to see. Um,
Yeah.
it's like with what is it? Polyev won't get a security clearance because then he'd have to like, or then he can't speak. So I guess this is different in that maybe I think they're just probably still developing their policy and they'll probably try to run on a bit of a blank slate.
That's very optimistic of you, Steve. I think it's just like industry, industry, industry. Rights,
Yeah.
sure, sure, but not from the
Remove,
UN.
get the gatekeepers out, as Polyev would say. I'm surprised that isn't in there.
It pretty
Um,
much is.
or
Of
new gatekeepers for agriculture. The NDP go full on the other way, which is
course.
Government of Canada abolish all employer-specific work permits and that we only have open work permits.
Mhm. I wish somebody had said abolish the temporary foreign worker program, permanent residency with like an opportunity for like visitors, like, itinerant workers, whatever, or something. Anyways, I guess people are just still trying to get elected in some way or another.
Yeah,
Some
maybe
political.
they're limited. Like I don't, yeah, I mean, that's interesting why the NDP would still want the open work permits.
I think
But
maybe they're
again, saying
taking their
permanent,
cues from the like Kamala being told that she was too radical.
yeah.
So if she's too radical, I think the NDP is taking maybe some prompts and trying to rein it in a little bit. Who knows?
Greater enforcement of employer compliance, stable funding for the migrant worker support program, a foreign worker program for the seasonal agriculture worker program, and broad strategies to regularize the status of all foreign workers in Canada, a moratorium on deportation for people without status, and that they implement the UN Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and members of their families. So
Okay,
they
so they
capture
have in
quite a
a
few
back
other,
doorway kind of
yeah,
said they're not permanent residents, but
but they're
you
not
can't
able to,
remove
you
them.
can't make them leave. Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah. They're
yeah, it
not
was just
permanent,
a
no
less,
pathway, they're not permanent residents right away, but they can't be removed.
and they're gonna
I
have to have
assume they want to find some way to give them health care in the meantime if their work permits expire.
because that would be
Um,
within the International Convention for the Rights of Migrant Workers. So yeah,
mhm.
they just aren't saying it because that would seem too radical. Okay,
Yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah. So those are the recommendations.
okay.
It
You didn't mention the Liberals.
the Liberals were the governing
Oh,
party.
sorry.
We spent
There we
half
go.
an hour on the Liberals.
All right.
The so yeah, I mean my like overall thoughts are that again, it's interesting to just, this is landing at a time when the government for political reasons is trying to encourage, force, needle a million current foreign workers into leaving, which necessarily will involve making it more onerous, cumbersome to keep for them to stay.
But let's just pause for a second on these recommendations are coming from the Liberal Party, and how do they tally against the policies that are actually being enacted with respect to foreign workers?
The Citizenship and Immigration Committee is often more, for lack of better term, pro-immigrant than the
Yeah, for
government.
sure.
Yeah.
But it's I think that it stands to be noted that there is like a total discord at this
Hmm.
moment between the recommendations from their standing committee. I mean, we all know that there's a complete chaos within the Liberal Party right now. But in this sense, every single one of the recommendations is going in entirely the wrong direction. I mean, the different direction from where the party is going with respect to the treatment of foreign workers in Canada right now.
We talked about it with Jason Kenney, that that discord even is within the minister, what he wants to do and what he's doing. Like he has publicly said that he does not want to, he disagrees with there not being a program to regularize the status of people here without status, and that he was essentially overruled. So the discord, and it's reflected then all the way down with statements of we aren't going to do the broad-based program, but we might do one that's narrow. We want to find a way to, the Liberals recommending a way to best practices and more open type work permits with a government policy right now that is 1 million people need to leave.
I just honestly can't believe that Trudeau is still holding on to that post right now. I still, you know, I keep waiting for something to shift there, but it's a very strange time.
Yeah. He, and it remains, yeah, we'll see. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just, as it's just, yeah, as we mentioned, they're like this report comes at a time when immigration lawyers, consultants are posting on social media or speaking with each other about how a lot of practice right now is delivering tough news and devising really difficult strategies for people.
Yeah.
At the House of Commons committee recognizes that there are problems and wants to change, but that is not the reality of the ground right now. And it
And the
will be
hard
interesting to see how the
thing,
government responds to the recommendations in this report.
yeah, the hard thing for us to communicate, I think, to the general public is how, and I mean, this isn't just about, like, I think there's this perception that this is just because we're trying to preserve our jobs. I think all of us could do with a lot less work right now. It's not about that, but just the being all the time presented with so many highly deserving candidates where we're struck by the wrongness, um, the the cruelness of people being told now, sorry, there's nothing we can do to help you. There's no viable strategy, or like when you find out, oh my God, somebody might actually be a citizen after all this time, like it's just the biggest win in your day that they've been here all this time and haven't realized that, but I think it's really beating us down, seeing all of these really sad situations of people who have done everything right, pursuing this strategy. And all of a sudden we're like,
Yeah.
thanks very much. No thanks.
I mean, looking back, and these are probably my final thoughts for today, like I always thought it was weird how during COVID, IRCC's response to COVID was not to say, you know what, there's going to be a reduction in numbers right now, but let's take the time to maybe reform programs, invest in systems. We got a little bit of downtime. Instead, it was, we will meet our targets. And everything went to that, right? The creation of the TRPR, which then led to them overshooting. But everything, all their press releases were, come hell or high water, we're going to meet our targets. And
Yeah.
that had all these unintended consequences that we're living with now to some extent.
Yeah.
Now today, we have a target of 5.1% foreign worker to overall population, and we will meet that target. And come hell or high water, we will meet that target. And there's just all these consequences from
Yeah.
this obsession with these numbered targets.
Yeah. Yeah. They're really, I think that the public is super confused. And it's not just confused because confusion leads to frustration and anger and like anguish and like all sorts of tension and fractions within the society. And I think that
Yeah.
it's already playing out. We've seen it happen in the United States, and I feel like we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg here in Canada so far. But
You sound a bit like Yoda there. But
yeah.
anyway,
Yeah, no, I was gonna try and come up with a good Yoda quote, but
well, it's fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to the
right.
dark side. So we're on our way.
There you go. We're on our
Anyways,
way. Yeah.
anyways,
Do or do not. There is no try. Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, so there we said we weren't going to do a dark episode. Well, so much for that. But
Yeah. Next
yeah.
week's we shift entirely, assuming that the guest stays, which will be a bit of a history episode.
Mm. Yeah, that'll be very, very interesting.
All right. Until then,
Yeah. Ciao.
ciao.